You are nothing more than temple scum, and everyone knows it." The words hit Lyra like stones thrown at her back as she scrubbed the marble floors of the sacred temple. She had heard variations of this particular cruelty so many times that her wolf barely even stirred anymore. The pack members who passed through the temple doors never bothered to lower their voices when they spoke about her, as if she were no more sentient than the mop in her hands or the bucket of dirty water at her feet. She kept her head down and continued her work, letting the repetitive motion of the scrub brush drown out their voices. That had always been enough. Invisibility was survival, and she had perfected the art of becoming nothing more than a shadow that cleaned up after everyone else. But today felt different. Today her wolf was restless in ways she did not understand, pacing beneath her skin like it was searching for something that remained just out of reach. Lyra tried to ignore the sensation as she worked her way across the temple floor, but the feeling only grew stronger as the morning wore on. The Moonlight Temple stood at the heart of their pack's territory, its ancient stone walls holding secrets that went back generations. Most of the pack members who visited came to pray to the moon goddess, or to seek blessings before important ceremonies, but Lyra knew this place differently than anyone else. She knew every hidden passage, every concealed alcove, every secret that the builders had woven into the very foundations, and she knew about the chamber beneath the altar that no one else even suspected existed. As the morning crowd of worshippers thinned, Lyra gathered her cleaning supplies and made her way toward the front of the temple. The massive altar dominated the sacred space, carved from a single piece of white marble that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Ancient symbols covered every surface, telling stories of the first Alpha Queens and the power they had wielded to protect their people. Lyra had memorized every symbol, every story, because this altar was more than just a place of worship. It was the entrance to her most sacred duty. She waited until the temple was completely empty, then pressed her palm against a specific combination of symbols. The marble shifted silently, revealing steps that descended into darkness. Lyra lit a torch from the altar's eternal flame and made her way down into the hidden chamber that had been her responsibility since the day she turned 18. The chamber was small and circular, its walls lined with more ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint silver light. But at the centre of the space sat something that took her breath away every single time she saw it. A crystalline relic the size of her torso, perfectly clear except for the swirling silver mist that moved within it like captured moonlight. The Moonlight Crystal, the last remnant of the ancient Alpha Queen bloodline, containing power that had been sealed away for 3 centuries, and Lyra was its guardian, sworn by blood and magic to protect it until the prophecies were fulfilled and the true heir returned. She approached the crystal carefully, as she did every morning, and placed her hands on its smooth surface. The moment her skin made contact, warmth spread up her arms, and the silver mist within began to swirl faster. This was how it always responded to her touch, recognizing her as the last of the guardian bloodline, even though she had no wolf rank or social status to speak of. But today, something was wrong. The crystal was warmer than usual, and the silver mist was moving with an urgency she had never seen before. As Lyra watched, the swirling patterns began to form shapes that looked almost like symbols, as if the crystal was trying to communicate something important. She pressed her forehead against the warm surface and whispered the ancient words her grandmother had taught her before she died. "I am here, Sacred One. I am listening." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Images flooded her mind, visions of a powerful presence approaching their territory. She saw a figure wreathed in shadows and authority, carrying the unmistakable aura of an Alpha King. But this was not just any Alpha, she realized with growing alarm. This was someone whose bloodline resonated with the crystal itself, someone whose very existence threatened the careful balance she had maintained for years. Lyra jerked her hands away from the crystal, gasping as the visions faded. Her heart was pounding, and her wolf was now fully awake, pacing frantically as if it sensed the same approaching danger. The crystal continued to glow brighter than she had ever seen it, casting dancing shadows on the chamber walls. She had to get back upstairs before someone noticed her absence. The temple would be busy today with preparations for the lunar selection ceremony, an event that brought representatives from packs across the continent. Noble families would present their daughters to the visiting Alpha King, hoping one would be chosen as his mate and Luna. Lyra had never paid much attention to pack politics before, but as she climbed the hidden steps back to the main temple, she could not shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The crystal had never reacted so strongly to anything, and the urgency in those swirling patterns suggested that whatever was coming would arrive soon. She emerged from the hidden chamber and carefully sealed the entrance, then gathered her cleaning supplies with hands that still trembled slightly. The temple was already filling with pack members again, their voices echoing off the high stone ceiling as they discussed the ceremony preparations. As Lyra made her way toward the back of the temple, she caught fragments of their conversations. The Alpha King would arrive before sunset. His wolf was said to be enormous and silver, a sign of the ancient royal bloodlines. He had never taken a mate, despite ruling for over a decade, and speculation about his choice dominated every discussion. Lyra tried to focus on her work, but her wolf remained restless throughout the afternoon. Every time someone entered the temple, she found herself looking up despite her better judgment, as if expecting to see the figure from her vision walking through those doors. The crystal continued to call to her from its hidden chamber, its warmth a constant presence at the edge of her consciousness. By evening, the temple was busier than she had seen it in years. Noble families had arrived from distant packs, their daughters dressed in their finest gowns and jewellery. They moved through the sacred space like colourful birds, their laughter and conversations creating a festive atmosphere that felt strange in the normally solemn environment. Lyra kept to the shadows, cleaning around the edges of the crowd as she always did. She was invisible to them, just another servant maintaining the temple, and that was exactly how she needed it to be. But as the sun began to set and the torch flames were lit throughout the space, her wolf grew more agitated with each passing moment. And then she felt it. A presence unlike anything she had ever experienced, approaching the temple with the inexorable force of a storm front. The very air seemed to thicken with power, and conversations began to die as everyone felt the weight of something massive drawing near. Elder Priestess Mira, who had been Lyra's only ally and protector since childhood, appeared at her side with unusual urgency. The old woman's eyes were wide with an emotion that looked dangerously close to fear. "Child," she whispered, gripping Lyra's arm with surprising strength. "The old powers stir tonight. I can feel them waking, responding to something that approaches. You must be very careful. The crystal calls to forces beyond our understanding, and tonight those forces come seeking answers." Before Lyra could ask what she meant, the massive temple doors opened and a hush fell over the entire crowd. The Alpha King had arrived, and with him came a presence so overwhelming that even the stones beneath their feet seemed to recognize his authority. Lyra's wolf went absolutely silent, as if it were holding its breath. And far below in the hidden chamber, the moonlight crystal began to sing. The grand ceremony took place 7 days after Lyra's awakening, when representatives from every major supernatural territory had arrived to witness what many were already calling the most significant royal mating in centuries. The temple had been transformed by the residual power of the shattered crystal into something that transcended its original architecture, with walls that seemed to be carved from starlight itself and floors that reflected the phases of the moon in their polished surface. Lyra stood before the ancient altar wearing robes that had been woven from moonbeams and silver thread, garments that existed as much in the realm of magic as in physical reality. Her dark hair was crowned with a circlet of crystallized starlight, and when she moved, silver fire danced beneath her skin like living jewelry. She was every inch the Lunar Queen the prophecies had promised, but when she looked at Kieran, her eyes still held the warmth of the woman who had fallen in love with him in a hidden chamber beneath the temple floor. Kieran himself was magnificent in ceremonial armour that had been forged from metals that fell from the sky during lunar eclipses, each piece inscribed with symbols that told the story of his bloodline service to their people. His silver eyes reflected the supernatural radiance that filled the temple, and when he smiled at his mate, every being present could feel the depth of connection that bound them together. The ceremony itself was unlike anything that had been performed in living memory, drawing on traditions that reached back to the first supernatural courts. Representatives from the vampire covens stood beside werewolf pack leaders, Fey nobility shared space with ancient dragon clans, and beings whose names were spoken only in whispers observed from shadows that seemed deeper than natural darkness should allow. Elder Priestess Mira officiated, her voice carrying the weight of centuries as she spoke, the binding words that would join not just two individuals, but two bloodlines whose union would reshape the supernatural world's political landscape. "Before the assembled courts of our realm," she intoned, "we witnessed the completion of a bond that was written in starlight before either of these souls took mortal form. Lyra Moonwright, last daughter of the ancient line, do you claim Kieran Blackthorn as your mate, your king, your equal in all things supernatural and mundane?" "I do," Lyra replied, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated through every supernatural being present. "I claim him not just as my mate, but as my partner in the sacred duty we share to protect and guide all who acknowledge our authority." "And do you, Kieran Blackthorn, Alpha King by right of conquest and blood, claim Lyra Moonwright as your mate, your queen, your equal in all things supernatural and mundane?" "I do," Kieran answered, his words backed by the full force of his royal authority. "I claim her not just as my mate, but as the Lunar Queen our people have waited centuries to see return to power." As they spoke their vows, the mate bond between them blazed with such intensity that it became visible to everyone present. Golden threads of connection that wrapped around them both and extended outward to encompass the entire assembled crowd. For that moment, every being in the temple could feel the strength of their bond, the completeness of their commitment to each other and to their shared destiny. But the ceremony was more than just a romantic ritual. As the formal words were spoken, Lyra felt her consciousness expanding beyond even what she had experienced during her awakening. Through the strengthened pack bonds, she could sense every wolf within 100 miles, could feel their hopes and fears and desperate need for leadership that would guide them through the challenges that lay ahead. More than that, she could sense the delicate balance of power that governed the supernatural world, and she understood with crystalline clarity that her awakening had shifted that balance in ways that would require careful management. There were courts that would see her return as a threat to their own authority, covens that would test her resolve, and ancient beings that would challenge her right to claim dominion over territories they considered their own. But as she looked out at the assembled representatives, she also saw opportunity. The supernatural world had been fragmented for too long, with each species keeping to their own territories and their own concerns. Her awakening offered a chance to forge new alliances, to create stability that had not existed since the first supernatural courts had fallen to internal conflict centuries ago. When the formal binding was complete, Kieran took her hand and led her to the twin thrones that had materialized at the front of the temple, seats of power that seemed to be carved from crystallized moonlight and starfire. As they sat together before their assembled subjects and allies, Lyra felt the weight of true authority settling around her shoulders. "Let it be known throughout all the realms," she declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the temple and beyond, "that the Moonwright bloodline reclaims its ancestral seat of power. We offer alliance to those who would stand with us in protecting the innocent and maintaining the ancient laws that govern our kind. We offer redemption to those who have lost their way but seek to return to honourable paths, and we offer swift justice to any who would threaten the peace we seek to build." The response from the assembled crowd was immediate and overwhelming. Pack leaders who had spent decades feuding with each other stepped forward to pledge their loyalty. Vampire lords who had not acknowledged werewolf authority in centuries offered formal recognition of her queenship. Even representatives from the Fey courts, notoriously reluctant to bind themselves to mortal rulers, spoke words of cautious respect for the power she had demonstrated. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from the common supernatural beings who had gathered outside the temple to witness the ceremony. Through the expanded pack bonds, Lyra could feel their relief and hope as they realized that the chaos and uncertainty that had plagued their world for generations might finally be coming to an end. As the formal recognition ceremonies continued late into the night, Lyra found herself remembering the girl who had scrubbed temple floors just weeks ago, who had believed herself to be nothing more than an invisible servant with no value beyond her ability to keep sacred spaces clean. The transformation she had undergone was more than just magical. It was a complete reimagining of her own worth and potential. But it was Kieran's presence beside her that made all of it meaningful. Without him, the power and recognition would have felt hollow, just another duty to be endured rather than a destiny to be embraced. With him, every moment felt like a gift, every challenge an opportunity to grow stronger together. When the last formal pledge had been spoken and the assembled crowd began to disperse, Lyra and Kieran remained in their crystalline thrones, watching as their new subjects and allies filed out of the transformed temple. The silver light that had filled the space during the ceremony had settled into a gentle glow that made everything seem touched with starlight. "So," Kieran said, his voice carrying the hint of amusement that never failed to make her smile. "How does it feel to be acknowledged as queen by beings who have not bowed to anyone in centuries?" Lyra considered the question, thinking about all the ways her life had changed since the crystal had first begun to sing in response to his presence. "It feels like responsibility," she said finally. "Like every choice we make from now on will affect not just us, but thousands of others who are counting on us to be worthy of the power we have been given." "Are you ready for that kind of responsibility?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. Lyra turned to look at him. This man who had chosen her when choosing her made no political sense, who had anchored her during her transformation when she might have been lost to forces beyond mortal comprehension. "I am ready for anything, as long as we face it together." As if responding to their words, the temple itself seemed to pulse with approval, the crystallized walls reflecting their image back at them in infinite variations, not just as they were now, but as they might become, as the legends that would be told about them in generations to come. And in every reflection they were together, the Alpha King and the Lunar Queen, whose love had restored balance to a world that had forgotten what it meant to have hope. 3 months after the grand mating ceremony, the crystalline palace that had grown from the transformed temple had become the beating heart of a supernatural renaissance that was reshaping their world. Where once there had been isolated territories governed by fear and mistrust, now there were thriving alliances built on the foundation of Lyra and Kieran's unified leadership. Lyra stood on the palace's highest balcony, watching as delegations from distant courts arrived for the monthly council meetings that had become essential to maintaining peace across the supernatural realm. Her silver-touched hair moved in the evening breeze, and the circlet of starlight that marked her as Lunar Queen caught the last rays of sunlight, sending prisms of rainbow fire across the courtyard below. The changes in their world were visible everywhere she looked. Werewolf pack members worked alongside vampire craftsmen to build new settlements that could house both species safely. Fey merchants traded openly in markets that had once been restricted to single supernatural types. Young beings from every court came to study at the academy that had been established in the palace's eastern wing, learning not just to control their abilities, but to use them in service of something greater than their own ambitions. But perhaps the most significant change was in the supernatural beings themselves. The fear and suspicion that had defined intercourt relations for centuries was slowly giving way to curiosity and cooperation. It was not a perfect transformation. There were still disputes to mediate, still ancient prejudices to overcome, but the progress was undeniable. "You look thoughtful," Kieran said, approaching from behind and wrapping his arms around her waist. Even after months of marriage, his touch still sent warmth racing through her veins, still made her wolf purr with contentment at their mate's proximity. "I was thinking about how different everything is now," she replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. 3 months ago, I was scrubbing temple floors and believing I was nothing more than an invisible servant. Now I spend my days negotiating treaties between dragon clans and mediating disputes between vampire covens." "Any regrets?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Lyra turned in his arms to face him, noting the way his silver eyes reflected the palace's crystalline glow. "None," she said firmly. "Even when the responsibility feels overwhelming, even when I make mistakes that affect thousands of people, I have never regretted accepting who I was meant to be." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus, who had become one of their most trusted advisors in the months following his redemption. His face bore the serious expression that meant important news, but there was also something that looked like barely contained excitement. "Your Majesties," he said, offering the respectful bow that had become standard protocol. "The delegation from the northern courts has arrived, and they bring news that changes everything we thought we knew about the ancient bloodlines." Kieran straightened, his attention immediately focusing with the intensity that made him such an effective king. "What kind of news?" "They have found others," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the weight of revelation. "Other Moonright descendants, hidden in territories so remote that they escaped the purges that were supposed to eliminate the bloodline entirely. Not just 1 or 2 individuals, but entire family lines that have been living in secret for centuries." Lyra felt her knees go weak with the implications. She had spent her entire life believing she was the last of her kind, the final guardian of powers that would die with her. To learn that there were others, that the bloodline she had thought extinct was actually scattered but surviving, was overwhelming in ways she struggled to process. "How many?" she managed to ask. "At least 50 confirmed descendants across 7 different territories," Marcus continued, "some showing active abilities, others with latent powers that never awakened because they lacked access to focusing crystals like the one that triggered your transformation." The possibilities that opened up with this news were staggering. Lyra had been struggling to manage the expanded consciousness that came with her awakened abilities, trying to maintain awareness of supernatural events across vast territories. But with other Moonright descendants to share the load, to help anchor the expanded network of pack bonds and territorial connections, they could create a web of leadership that would be both more stable and more effective than anything she could accomplish alone. "There is more," Marcus added, his excitement now impossible to contain. "The Northern delegation reports that several of the hidden bloodlines have been maintaining their own versions of the ancient academies. They have preserved knowledge and techniques that were lost during the purges, training methods and ritual practices that could help newly awakened descendants control their abilities more effectively." Kieran's arms tightened around Lyra as he felt her emotional response through the mate bond. "This changes our entire strategic approach," he said thoughtfully. "Instead of trying to govern the supernatural world from a single central location, we can establish a network of Moonright-descended leaders, each anchoring their own regional territories while maintaining connection to the larger alliance." Lyra nodded, her mind already racing through the implications. "We could offer them the same awakening ritual that transformed me, but in a controlled environment with proper support structures. No more hidden guardians living in isolation, no more lost bloodlines struggling alone with powers they do not understand." The conversation continued well into the evening as they planned the logistics of contact and integration. But even as they worked through the practical challenges, Lyra found herself thinking about what this meant on a personal level. She would no longer be unique, no longer the only one carrying the weight of ancient responsibilities. Instead, she would be part of a community, connected to others who understood the burden and the blessing of their inherited abilities. The loneliness that had defined so much of her early life would finally be healed. Later that night, as she and Kieran lay together in their private chambers with moonlight streaming through crystal windows, she felt a subtle shift in her body that had nothing to do with supernatural powers or royal responsibilities. "Kieran," she said softly, placing his hand on her still flat stomach, "I think we are going to need to add another chair to the royal table." His silver eyes went wide with understanding and wonder. "Are you certain?" "My enhanced senses do not lie," she replied, smiling at the expression of pure joy that spread across his face. "The royal bloodline will continue into another generation." As he kissed her with reverence and fierce love, Lyra felt the final piece of her transformation settle into place. She was no longer just the last guardian of a dying bloodline. She was the first queen of a dynasty that would endure for generations to come, with a mate who loved her completely and a growing family that would carry their combined legacy into the future. Through the expanded pack bonds, she could sense the sleeping contentment of their subjects across the territory, the peaceful dreams of beings who no longer feared what tomorrow might bring. The supernatural world they were building together was not perfect, but it was filled with hope and possibility in ways that had not existed for centuries. And at the centre of it all was the love between an Alpha King who had chosen his heart over political convenience and a Lunar Queen who had learned that her worth was not determined by what others saw when they looked at her, but by the courage to embrace her own truth and share it with someone who treasured every facet of who she was. 2 years had passed since the night Lyra's world changed forever, and the crystalline palace gardens where she now walked with her infant daughter had become a symbol of the new golden age that had dawned across the supernatural realm. The child in her arms carried the combined bloodlines of both ancient dynasties, her tiny fingers already showing the faint silver glow that marked her as heir to powers that would reshape their world for generations to come. Princess Elena Moonright Blackthorn was barely 6 months old, but her presence had already stabilized the magical matrix that connected all the supernatural territories in ways that exceeded even Lyra's most optimistic projections. The child's natural harmony with both werewolf and ancient queen bloodlines created resonance patterns that made communication between distant courts easier and strengthened the alliance bonds that held their growing coalition together. Lyra paused beside the memorial fountain that had been erected where the original Moonright crystal had once stood, its waters flowing with liquid starlight that never dimmed regardless of the time of day or phase of the moon. The fountain served as both remembrance of what had been sacrificed and celebration of what had been gained, a reminder that sometimes the greatest transformations required the destruction of everything that came before. "She has your eyes," Kieran said, joining his family in the garden, as he did every evening when his royal duties permitted. Even after 2 years of marriage and months of parenthood, the sight of him still made Lyra's heart skip with the same recognition that had first sparked between them in the hidden temple chamber. "And your stubbornness," Lyra replied with fond exasperation, noting the way baby Eleanor refused to be swayed from her determined examination of the fountain's magical waters. "She has been trying to reach the starlight for the past hour, completely ignoring every toy I have offered her." Kieran laughed, the sound carrying the warmth and contentment that had become his default state since their daughter's birth. Intelligence and determination are good qualities in a future queen, though perhaps we should start working on patience as well. As if responding to her father's words, Eleanor turned her silver-touched eyes toward him and made the soft cooing sounds that had become her preferred method of expressing approval. The mate bond carried his surge of paternal love directly to Lyra, adding to her own overwhelming affection for the child who represented everything they had built together. The garden around them was filled with representatives from all the supernatural courts who had come to celebrate the 2nd anniversary of the royal mating and to witness the formal presentation of the princess to the assembled alliance. But unlike the formal ceremony 2 years ago, tonight's gathering felt more like a family celebration than a political necessity. Vampire children played alongside werewolf pups in the crystalline pavilions, their games supervised by fey nobles who had discovered unexpected talent for managing young supernatural beings. Dragon Clan representatives shared ancient stories with rapt audiences that included beings from every court, their tales weaving together the histories of species that had been isolated from each other for centuries. "Look at them," Lyra said, gesturing toward the mixed groups that filled every corner of the garden. 2 years ago, most of these courts had not communicated in decades. Now their children grow up together as if interspecies friendship is the most natural thing in the world. "Because for them it is natural," Kieran replied, his expression thoughtful as he watched a young vampire girl teach a werewolf boy how to manipulate shadow magic. They have never known a world where the courts were separated by fear and mistrust. This is simply how their reality has always been. The transformation of the supernatural world had not been without challenges. There had been territorial disputes to mediate, ancient grudges to overcome, and conservative factions within several courts who resisted the changes that integration brought. But for every problem that arose, the combined wisdom and power of the Moonright-Blackthorn partnership had found solutions that strengthened rather than weakened the alliance. The network of awakened Moonright descendants that had been established across the realm had proven invaluable in maintaining stability. Each regional leader anchored their own territorial bonds while remaining connected to the larger magical matrix, creating a web of communication and mutual support that made isolated conflicts nearly impossible to sustain. "Do you ever miss it?" Kieran asked suddenly, his question carrying the weight of deeper meaning. "The simplicity of your old life when your biggest concern was keeping the temple floors clean?" Lyra considered the question seriously, thinking back to the girl who had believed herself invisible and worthless. "Sometimes I miss the quietness of it," she admitted. "There was a peace in believing that my problems were small and contained, but I would not trade what we have built for any amount of simplicity." She shifted Elena to her other arm, noting how the baby's presence seemed to intensify the silver light that flowed through the fountain's waters. "Besides, I was never truly happy in that old life. I was surviving, enduring, making myself small enough to avoid notice. I thought that was enough, but it was not living. It was just existing." "And now?" Kieran asked, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. "Now I wake up every morning knowing that my choices matter, that the love I share with you creates ripples that strengthen our entire world, that our daughter will grow up believing she can be anything she chooses to be." Lyra turned to face him fully, silver light dancing in her eyes like captured starfire. "I spent years believing I was nobody. Now I know I am exactly who I was always meant to be." As if summoned by their conversation, Elder Priestess Mira approached through the garden paths, moving with the careful dignity of someone whose advanced age had been extended by proximity to the royal bloodline's magical energies. The years since Lyra's awakening had been kinder to the old woman than the decades before, her devotion to the restored dynasty rewarding her with renewed vitality and purpose. "Your Majesties," she said, with the warm smile that had replaced her once worried expression. "The assembled courts are ready for the formal presentation ceremony, though I suspect Princess Elena has already charmed most of them during the informal gatherings." Indeed, the baby had become the darling of every delegation that visited the palace, her natural harmony with all forms of supernatural energy making even the most reserved court representatives soften with protective affection. She represented hope for the future in ways that transcended political alliances or territorial agreements. The ceremony that followed was beautiful in its simplicity. Unlike the grand spectacle of the royal mating 2 years earlier, the presentation of the princess was intimate and focused on the personal rather than the political. Each court representative offered traditional blessings for the child's health and happiness, their voices weaving together in harmonies that seemed to strengthen the magical bonds connecting all present. But it was the moment when Lyra stood before the assembled crowd, holding her daughter in the same spot where she had once knelt as a powerless temple servant, that the full scope of her transformation truly struck her. 2 years ago, I stood in this very place believing I was nothing more than an invisible servant whose only value lay in her ability to clean forgotten corners, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the garden without need for magical amplification. I had been told my entire life that I was worthless, that I deserved nothing, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity others chose to offer me. She paused, looking out at faces that represented every major supernatural power in their realm, all of them focused on her words with the respect and attention that she had once believed impossible. But I learned something that changed everything. I learned that our worth is not determined by what others see when they look at us, but by the courage to embrace our own truth and share it with those who treasure every facet of who we are. Her eyes found Kieran's across the crowd, and the mate bond pulsed with the warmth of their connection. I learned that love is not about becoming someone different, but about finding someone who sees the beauty in who you already are. As applause rose from the assembled crowd, Lyra felt Elena stir in her arms, the baby's silver eyes opening to survey the faces around them with the calm acceptance of someone who had never doubted her own worth or place in the world. This, Lyra realized, was perhaps her greatest accomplishment, not the awakening of ancient powers or the establishment of supernatural alliances, but the creation of a world where her daughter would grow up knowing she was valued, cherished, and capable of anything she chose to pursue. The evening concluded with Elena falling asleep in her father's arms while her parents stood together on the palace's highest balcony, looking out over a realm that glowed with the gentle light of sustained peace and prosperity. The challenges ahead would require continued vigilance and wisdom, but they would face them as they had faced everything else, together, anchored by a love that had already transformed their world and would continue to shape it for generations to come. "I love you," Kieran said softly, his words carrying all the wonder and gratitude of someone who had found exactly what he had not known he was searching for. "And I love you," Lyra replied, the simple truth containing within it everything they had built and everything they would become. Above them, the stars blazed with silver fire, and the crystalline palace hummed with the contentment of a dynasty that had found its perfect balance between power and compassion, duty and love, ancient wisdom and hopeful innovation. The Alpha King moved through the temple doors like darkness given form, his presence so overwhelming that the very air seemed to bend around him. Lyra pressed herself deeper into the shadows near the back wall, her cleaning cloth forgotten in her hands as she watched the crowd part before him like water around a stone. He was larger than any wolf she had ever seen in human form, his shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, and his height making even the tallest pack warriors look small beside him. Black hair fell to his shoulders, and when he turned his head to survey the assembled crowd, she caught a glimpse of eyes that seemed to hold silver fire. This was Kieran Blackthorne, the legendary Alpha King whose very name was whispered with reverence and fear across every territory. But it was not his physical presence that made her wolf cower in the depths of her mind. It was the power that radiated from him in waves, an ancient authority that spoke to something primal in every supernatural being present. This was what it meant to be descended from the first alpha bloodlines, to carry the weight of centuries in your very bones. And the moment he stepped into the temple, the moonlight crystal began to sing louder. Lyra could hear it even from the main chamber, a high crystalline note that resonated through the stone floors and into her body. She pressed her hand against the wall, feeling the vibrations travel up through the ancient marble, and prayed that no one else could sense what she was experiencing. The crystal had never responded to anyone like this, not in all the years she had been its guardian. The Alpha King paused just inside the doorway, his head tilting slightly as if he were listening to something only he could hear. His wolf was scanning the crowd with predatory intensity, searching for something that remained frustratingly out of reach. Lyra could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as his beast prowled beneath the surface. Elder Priestess Mira stepped forward to greet him, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "Your Majesty, the Moonright Temple welcomes you. The Moon Goddess has blessed us with your presence on this sacred night." Kieran inclined his head slightly, but his attention was clearly elsewhere. His gaze swept across the assembled noble families, lingering for a moment on each potential lunar candidate before moving on with what looked like disappointment. When his eyes passed over Lyra's shadowed corner, she held her breath, but he looked right through her as if she were part of the temple furnishings. That should have been a relief. Instead, her wolf whimpered softly, a sound that confused her more than anything else that had happened today. "I thank you for the welcome, priestess," Kieran said, his voice carrying the rough edge of barely contained power. "I understand there are many daughters of noble bloodlines here tonight." As if summoned by his words, the crowd shifted to reveal the most prominent candidates. At the front stood Seraphina Goldmane, her blonde hair catching the torchlight like spun gold, and her dress chosen to emphasize every perfect curve. She was everything Lyra was not: beautiful, confident, born to nobility, and completely certain of her place in the world. Seraphina stepped forward with practiced grace, offering a curtsy that managed to be both respectful and seductive. "Your Majesty, I am honoured to be in your presence. My father speaks often of your legendary strength and wisdom." Other noble daughters followed her example, each introducing herself with the polished confidence that came from a lifetime of privilege. They were lovely, accomplished, politically advantageous, and utterly forgettable. Lyra watched Kieran's face as he acknowledged each one, noting the growing tension in his jaw and the way his wolf seemed to grow more agitated with every interaction. He was looking for something specific, she realized, something that none of these perfect candidates possessed. The formal presentations continued for what felt like hours, but underneath the civilized ceremony, Lyra could sense a growing restlessness that went beyond the Alpha King's obvious disappointment. The crystal was still singing its crystalline song, growing stronger with each passing moment, and she began to worry that someone else would notice the strange resonance. As the evening wore on, she tried to retreat further into the shadows, but the temple was too crowded for her to slip away unnoticed. She was trapped in her corner, forced to watch as the most powerful alpha in centuries grew increasingly frustrated with the selection process. "Perhaps His Majesty would prefer some time for private contemplation," Elder Priestess Mira suggested diplomatically. "The sacred chamber behind the altar has been prepared for meditation and prayer." Lyra's blood turned to ice. The sacred chamber Mira referred to was directly above the hidden space that housed the crystal. If Kieran spent time there, he would be close enough to sense the artifact's presence, close enough for his wolf to identify the source of whatever was calling to him. She had to get down to the chamber and find some way to quiet the crystal before it revealed itself completely. But as she began to edge toward the side passages that led to the hidden stairs, Seraphina's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. "Of course, Your Majesty might prefer company during his contemplation," the noble daughter said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I would be honoured to share in whatever spiritual guidance the goddess might provide." There was something in Seraphina's tone that made Lyra's skin crawl, a subtle possessiveness that went beyond mere political manoeuvring. This was not just about securing an advantageous mating. This was about claiming something that Seraphina believed belonged to her by right. Kieran's response was diplomatically neutral, but Lyra caught the flash of irritation that crossed his features. "I appreciate the offer, but I prefer to commune with the goddess alone." As the crowd began to disperse for the evening, giving the Alpha King the space he had requested, Lyra finally managed to slip away from her corner. She moved through the side passages like a ghost, using routes that she had learned during years of invisible servitude. The crystal's song was growing so loud in her mind that she wondered how anyone could miss it. She reached the hidden chamber just as the main temple fell quiet above. The crystal was glowing so brightly that the entire space was bathed in silver light, and the moment she stepped into the room, it pulsed with recognition. But this time, something was different. This time, the silver mist within the crystal was not just swirling randomly. It was reaching toward the ceiling, toward the sacred chamber above where she knew the Alpha King now sat in meditation. Lyra pressed her palms against the crystal's surface, trying to pour her own energy into it to calm the agitation, but instead of settling, the artifact's song grew even stronger. Visions flooded her mind again, clearer this time, and more urgent. She saw the Alpha King sitting in the chamber above, his wolf pacing restlessly as it tried to identify the source of the power that called to it. She saw Seraphina watching from the shadows with calculating eyes, and she saw something else, something that made her gasp and pull her hands away from the crystal. She saw herself, but not as she was now. In the vision, she stood in a place of honor, power radiating from her skin like silver fire, and beside her stood the Alpha King. Not as strangers, but as partners, as mates. Impossible. The crystal was showing her impossible things. But even as she tried to deny what she had seen, her wolf stirred for the first time in hours, lifting its head with sudden interest. And from somewhere above, she heard the sound of footsteps moving across the temple floor with predatory purpose. The Alpha King was searching, and with every step he took, the crystal sang louder, calling to something in his bloodline that recognized the power it contained. Lyra realized with growing panic that she was about to lose the secret she had spent her entire life protecting. The footsteps paused directly above the hidden chamber, and she heard the Alpha King's voice, rough with confusion and hunger. "What are you hiding from me?" The crystal pulsed once brilliantly, and Lyra knew that everything was about to change. The temple fell into the deep silence that comes only in the hours before dawn, when even the most restless spirits find peace. Lyra had waited in the hidden chamber until she was certain everyone had retired for the night, but the crystal refused to quiet. If anything, its song had grown more insistent, the silver mist within swirling in patterns that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her own heartbeat. She could not leave it like this. Tomorrow would bring more ceremonies, more crowds, and more opportunities for someone to notice the strange resonance that filled the temple stones. She had to perform the calming ritual her grandmother had taught her, the one that required her to channel her own life force into the crystal to settle its agitation. Lyra knelt before the artifact and began the ancient words, letting her palms rest against its warm surface as she poured her energy into the crystalline structure. But the moment her power touched the silver mist within, something went catastrophically wrong. Instead of calming, the crystal blazed with light so brilliant that she had to squeeze her eyes shut. The singing became a roar that she felt in her bones, and the chamber filled with power so intense that the very air seemed to shimmer. She tried to pull her hands away, but they seemed fused to the crystal's surface, held there by forces beyond her understanding. And then she felt him approaching. The Alpha King's presence descended the hidden stairs like a storm front, his power preceding him in waves that made her wolf cower and bare its throat in submission. But there was something else in his energy signature, something that called to the deepest parts of her soul with recognition that defied all logic. Kieran stepped into the chamber and stopped dead, his silver eyes taking in the scene before him. The invisible temple servant he had looked right through, kneeling before a crystal artifact that blazed with the power of ancient bloodlines. Her dark hair had come loose from its braid and fell around her like shadows, and in the silver light of the crystal, her skin seemed to glow with its own inner radiance. "You!" he breathed, and the word carried the weight of prophecy. Lyra finally managed to break contact with the crystal, stumbling backward as the light dimmed to its usual gentle glow. She pressed herself against the chamber wall, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it echoing off the stone. "Your Majesty, I can explain—" "You are the source." Kieran moved toward her with predatory grace, his eyes never leaving her face. "My wolf has been going insane since the moment I arrived, searching for something that called to every instinct I possess. And it was you." The space between them seemed to crackle with energy, and Lyra could feel something building in the air like the pressure before a lightning strike. Her wolf was no longer cowering. Instead, it had gone absolutely still, as if it were waiting for something momentous to happen. Kieran stopped just within arm's reach, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his dark eyes and feel the heat radiating from his skin. "What are you?" he asked, his voice rough with something that sounded dangerously close to hunger. "I am nobody," Lyra whispered, the automatic response falling from her lips before she could stop it. "I am just—" "No." The word came out as a growl that seemed to rumble through the chamber walls. "You are not nobody. Nobody doesn't make ancient crystals sing with power. Nobody does not call to an Alpha King's wolf from across a crowded room." As if responding to his words, the crystal pulsed once, sending a wave of silver light across the chamber. The moment the light touched them both, Lyra felt something deep in her chest suddenly snap into place with an almost audible click. The mate bond. The recognition hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her knees weak. This could not be happening. She was a temple servant, invisible and worthless, and he was the Alpha King. The mate bond did not choose across such impossible divides, but even as her mind rejected what she was feeling, her wolf rose to its feet and began to sing. Kieran's eyes went wide, then flashed with silver fire as his own wolf responded to the call. The sound that emerged from his throat was part growl, part recognition, and completely primal. "Mate," he said, and the words seemed to hang in the air between them like a sacred oath. "No," Lyra gasped, pressing her hands against her chest as if she could physically hold the bond at bay. "No, this is impossible. I am nothing. I am no one. I cannot be—" Kieran moved faster than she could track, backing her against the chamber wall with his hands braced on either side of her head. His scent surrounded her, wild and masculine and completely overwhelming, and when he leaned close enough that his breath ghosted across her ear, her entire body shivered in response. "Feel that," he commanded, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in her bones. "Feel what happens when I am close to you. Feel what your wolf is telling you, and try to convince me that you are nothing." The mate bond pulsed between them like a living thing, sending waves of heat and recognition through every nerve ending. Lyra could feel his heartbeat as if it were her own, could sense the barely controlled hunger in his wolf, could taste his desire and confusion on her tongue. It was overwhelming and terrifying and absolutely undeniable. "This cannot happen," she whispered, but even she could hear how weak the protest sounded. "You are here to choose a Luna from the noble bloodlines. You are here to choose someone like Seraphina Goldmane." At the mention of the other woman's name, Kieran's expression hardened. "Seraphina Goldmane means nothing to me. Her bloodline means nothing to me. This," he pressed closer until she could feel the solid warmth of his body against hers. "This is what matters. This bond, this recognition, this impossible pull that has been driving me insane since the moment I set foot in your territory." The crystals suddenly blazed with light again, and this time Lyra saw the truth in the swirling silver mist. Images flashed before her eyes. Ancient queens with power blazing from their skin, ceremonies conducted in this very chamber, bloodlines stretching back to the first wolves who had walked under the moon's light. And at the centre of it all, a truth that changed everything she thought she knew about herself. "The Moonright bloodline," she breathed, understanding flooding through her like a revelation. "The crystal recognizes the Moonright bloodline in both of us." Kieran went very still against her, his silver eyes searching her face with sudden intensity. "That is impossible. The Moonright line died out 3 centuries ago. Everyone knows that." "Everyone was told that," Lyra corrected, her mind racing as pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "But bloodlines do not simply vanish. They hide, they wait, they guard sacred artifacts until the time comes for the truth to be revealed." The implications of what she was saying seemed to hit them both at the same time. If the crystal recognized Kieran as carrying Moonright blood, and if it had chosen Lyra as its guardian, then the mate bond between them was not just personal attraction. It was the fulfillment of ancient prophecy, the reuniting of bloodlines that had been separated by politics and war. But before either of them could fully process what this meant, footsteps echoed from the stairs above. Someone was coming. Kieran moved instantly, positioning himself between Lyra and the chamber entrance as his entire body went into protective mode. A low growl rumbled in his chest, warning off whatever threat approached. "Kieran?" Seraphina's voice drifted down the stairs, sweet and concerned and completely unwelcome. "I saw light coming from below the temple. Is everything all right?" Lyra felt ice flood her veins. If Seraphina discovered them here together, if she saw the crystal and realized what it meant, everything would be ruined. The noble daughter was not just beautiful and accomplished. She was intelligent and ruthless, and she would not hesitate to eliminate any threat to her own ambitions. Kieran seemed to realize the same thing. He turned back to Lyra, his eyes blazing with protective fury and something that looked like promise. "This is not over," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "The mate bond does not lie, and neither does ancient magic. We will find a way." But as Seraphina's footsteps grew closer, Lyra shook her head desperately. "You have to go. You have to choose her, or choose someone else, or find some way to make this go away. I cannot be your mate. I cannot be anyone's mate. I am sworn to guard the crystal, and that oath comes before everything else." The look that crossed Kieran's face was pure alpha dominance, the expression of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. "We will see about that," he said. And then Seraphina appeared at the chamber entrance, her beautiful face a mask of concern that did not quite hide the calculating gleam in her eyes. "Oh my," she said, taking in the scene before her with obvious satisfaction. "How very interesting." The crystal pulsed once more, as if it sensed the danger that had just entered its sacred space, and Lyra knew that everything she had spent her life protecting was about to be torn apart. The silence that followed Seraphina's arrival stretched like a blade between them, sharp enough to cut. Lyra watched the noble daughter's eyes take in every detail of the hidden chamber. The ancient symbols carved into the walls, the blazing crystal at its centre, and most dangerously, the unmistakable tension that crackled between her and the Alpha King. "How fascinating," Seraphina said, her voice honey-sweet with underlying venom. "I had no idea our little temple cleaner had such interesting secrets." Kieran moved subtly, positioning himself to block Seraphina's view of Lyra, but the damage was already done. Those calculating blue eyes had seen everything they needed to see, and Lyra could practically watch the wheels turning as Seraphina processed the implications of what she had discovered. "Lady Goldmane," Kieran said with careful neutrality, "I thought you had retired for the evening." "I was restless," Seraphina replied, stepping further into the chamber despite the clear dismissal in his tone. "I felt strange energy calling to me from below the temple. I thought perhaps you might be in danger." Her gaze slid to Lyra with predatory interest, though I see now that the danger might not be what I expected. Before anyone could respond, Elder Priestess Mira appeared at the chamber entrance, her ancient face grave with an urgency that made Lyra's blood run cold. The old woman took in the scene with knowing eyes, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of prophecy. "The crystal has chosen," she said simply. "After 3 centuries of waiting, the Moonright bloodlines have found each other again." Seraphina's mask of concern slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold fury beneath. "That is impossible. Everyone knows the Moonright line died out generations ago." Mira stepped into the chamber, her gnarled hands beginning to glow with soft silver light as she approached the crystal. Everyone was told that, because it was safer to let the world believe it. But some secrets are too important to die with their keepers. She placed her palms on the crystal's surface, and immediately the artifact responded with a brilliant pulse that filled the chamber with ancient power. When the light faded, the silver mist within had formed into clear images that none of them could deny. "Behold the truth that has been hidden for 300 years, Mira said, her voice taking on the resonant quality of deep magic. "When the first Alpha Queen fell in battle defending our people, her power was not lost. It was sealed within this crystal, waiting for the day when her bloodline would return to claim it." The images swirling within the crystal showed scenes from centuries past. A powerful queen with silver eyes and dark hair, her hands blazing with supernatural fire as she fought against enemies that would have destroyed their world. When she fell, mortally wounded but victorious, the last of her power flowed into the crystal that would become her legacy. "The Queen's youngest daughter survived," Mira continued, "but she was hidden away, her true heritage concealed, to protect her from those who would see the Moonright line extinguished forever. Her descendants became the crystal's guardians, keeping the power safe until the day when the royal bloodlines would reunite." Lyra's legs nearly gave out as the implications hit her. "You are saying that I am—" "You are the last daughter of the Moonright line," Mira confirmed, turning those ancient eyes to her with something that looked like pride. "And you," she faced Kieran with equal reverence, "carry the blood of the first Alpha Kings who ruled beside the Moonright Queens. The crystal recognizes both bloodlines because they were meant to rule together." Kieran's entire body had gone rigid with shock, but when he looked at Lyra, she saw understanding beginning to dawn in his silver eyes. The mate bond is not coincidence. It is prophecy fulfilling itself. "No." Seraphina's voice cut through the revelations like a whip, cold and sharp with fury. "I will not stand here and listen to fairy tales about bloodlines and prophecies. The Alpha King came here to choose a Luna from established noble families, not to chase romantic fantasies about disappeared royalty." She turned to Kieran with all the considerable force of her beauty and political training. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot be considering taking a temple servant as your mate, regardless of what stories this old woman tells. Think of your kingdom, your alliances, your duty to your people. You need a Luna who can stand beside you in the political arena, not a girl who has spent her life scrubbing floors." For a moment Lyra thought Kieran might waver. The weight of royal duty was not something that could be easily dismissed, and Seraphina's arguments had the cold logic of political necessity behind them. She held her breath, waiting for him to make the choice that would determine not just her fate, but the fate of the ancient power that had been entrusted to her care. But when Kieran spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable authority of an Alpha King who had made his decision. "My duty is to my people, Lady Goldmane, and my people deserve a Luna who was chosen by the goddess herself, not by political convenience." The crystal pulsed with approval, and Lyra felt the mate bond sing with harmonious recognition. But her relief was short-lived, because the look that crossed Seraphina's face was pure, undiluted hatred. "Very well," the noble daughter said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than any shout. "If that is your choice, your Majesty, then I suppose there is nothing more to say." She turned toward the chamber entrance, then paused. "Though I do hope you have considered all the possible consequences of such a dramatic decision." After Seraphina left, the chamber fell into uneasy quiet. Mira was still standing beside the crystal, her hands glowing as she communed with the ancient power within, but Lyra could see the worry in her weathered features. "She will not accept this," Lyra said, voicing what they were all thinking. "Seraphina will not simply walk away from losing the Alpha King to a temple servant." "No," Kieran agreed grimly, "she will not, which means we need to move quickly to establish your true identity before she has time to act against you." Mira nodded, her expression growing more serious. "The awakening ritual must be performed before the next full moon. Until Lyra claims her full power, she remains vulnerable to those who would see her destroyed." "Awakening ritual?" Lyra asked, though part of her already knew what the priestess meant. The power that had been sealed within the crystal for 3 centuries was meant to return to its rightful heir, but such a transfer would not be simple or safe. "You must bond fully with the crystal," Mira explained. "Allow it to release the accumulated power of your bloodline back into your body. But the process is dangerous. Many who have attempted to channel power of this magnitude have not survived the transformation." Kieran moved closer to Lyra, his presence warm and reassuring against her side. "She will not face it alone. The mate bond will help stabilize the process." "Perhaps," Mira said carefully, "or perhaps the combined power of both bloodlines will make the awakening even more intense. There are no precedents for what you are attempting." Lyra looked at the crystal, its silver light pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat, and felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a cloak. For her entire life she had been told she was nothing, worth nothing, deserving nothing. But if what Mira said was true, she was the heir to power that could reshape their world. The question was whether she would survive long enough to claim it. "How long do we have before the ritual must be performed?" Kieran asked. 7 days, Mira replied. "The new moon will provide the optimal conditions for the power transfer, but you must be careful until then. Others will sense the change in Lyra's energy signature as her true nature begins to emerge. Some will see her as a threat to be eliminated." As if summoned by her words, a low howl echoed from somewhere above them, followed by others. The sound carried notes of aggression and challenge that made Lyra's newly awakened wolf bristle with unease. Kieran's head snapped toward the chamber entrance, his entire body going into battle-ready tension. "We are not alone." The howls grew louder, and now Lyra could hear footsteps moving across the temple floor above. Multiple sets of feet, moving with coordinated purpose toward the hidden entrance. Seraphina," she breathed, understanding flooding through her with cold certainty. "She brought others?" Kieran's eyes blazed with silver fire as his wolf rose to the surface. "Then she has made her first mistake," he said, his voice carrying the deadly promise of an Alpha King prepared to defend his mate. "And it will be her last." The crystal suddenly flared with brilliant light, as if responding to the approaching threat, and Lyra felt power she had never known she possessed beginning to stir in the depths of her soul. The days that followed the revelation in the hidden chamber passed in a blur of preparation and growing tension. Lyra found herself under constant protection, with Kieran's most trusted warriors stationed throughout the temple grounds, and elder priestess Mira never far from her side. But despite their vigilance, she could feel hostile eyes watching her every movement, and her newly awakened wolf paced restlessly beneath her skin, sensing danger in every shadow. The lunar eclipse was only 3 days away, and with it would come the awakening ritual that would either transform her into the true heir of the Moonright line or destroy her completely. The crystal had been growing more active with each passing hour, its silver light pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat and sending waves of power through the temple stones that made everyone who entered feel the weight of ancient magic. Lyra was in the temple's main chamber, practicing the meditation techniques Mira had taught her to help control the power surges, when the servant girl approached with her evening meal. Kira was young, barely 16, and she had always been kind to Lyra in the small ways that servants showed solidarity with one another. A smile here, A shared burden there, the quiet understanding of those who existed at the bottom of the pack hierarchy. "I brought your favourite tonight," Kira said with a shy smile, setting down a tray that held roasted meat, fresh bread, and a cup of herbal tea that smelled of lavender and mint. "Elder Mira said you need to keep your strength up for the ritual." Lyra accepted the meal gratefully, her stomach reminding her that she had barely eaten all day. The stress of the past few days had stolen her appetite, but she knew Mira was right about maintaining her physical strength. The awakening process would demand everything her body could give. She had just taken her first bite of the meat when her wolf suddenly went rigid with alarm. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The taste that flooded her mouth was not the rich flavour of properly seasoned venison, but something bitter and metallic that made her throat burn. She spat out the food immediately, but she could already feel the poison spreading through her system like liquid fire. "Kira," she gasped, reaching for the servant girl, but her vision was already beginning to blur. "What did you—" The young servant's face had transformed from shy friendliness to cold satisfaction. "I am sorry, Lyra, but some opportunities are too valuable to pass up. Lady Seraphina promised my family land and status if I helped remove the threat to her rightful place as Luna." Lyra tried to call for help, but her voice came out as little more than a whisper. The poison was working quickly, spreading numbness through her limbs and making it difficult to think clearly. She stumbled toward the altar, hoping to reach the crystal that might be able to help her, but her legs gave out before she could cover half the distance. As she collapsed to the marble floor, she felt the mate bond suddenly flare with Kieran's alarm. He had felt her distress through their connection and was racing toward the temple, but she could sense that he was too far away to reach her in time. The crystal began to sing. The sound started low, almost below the range of hearing, but it grew stronger as Lyra's life force weakened. Silver light began to pour from the artifact, flowing across the temple floor toward her like liquid moonlight. When the light touched her skin, she felt the poison's burning grip begin to loosen. Kira backed away in terror as the temple filled with supernatural radiance. "That is not possible," she whispered. "The poison was supposed to kill you before you could reach the crystal." But the moonlight crystal had not waited for Lyra to come to it. Instead, it had come to her, extending its power through the ancient temple that had been built to channel its energy. As the silver light enveloped her body, Lyra felt the poison being systematically burned away, purged from her system by power that had waited 3 centuries to protect its rightful heir. More than that, she could suddenly hear things that had been beyond her perception before. The whispered conversations of the temple mice as they scurried through the walls. The distant howl of a wolf pack celebrating a successful hunt. The rapid heartbeat of the servant girl who stood frozen with shock and growing fear. The crystal was awakening abilities in her that she had never known she possessed. "You cannot kill her," a new voice said from the temple entrance, and Lyra looked up to see Elder Priestess Mira approaching with silver fire blazing in her ancient eyes. "The crystal will not allow its guardian to be destroyed by something as mundane as poison." Kira spun toward the priestess, desperation replacing the satisfaction in her expression. "But Lady Seraphina said, Lady Seraphina promised you things that were never hers to give," Mira cut her off coldly. "And now you have committed treason against the true Lunar Queen. The punishment for such betrayal is death." Before Kira could respond, the temple doors burst open and Kieran stormed inside, his entire body radiating the kind of fury that made seasoned warriors step back in fear. His silver eyes immediately found Lyra on the floor, still glowing with the crystal's protective light, and the growl that emerged from his throat was purely predatory. "Who?" he demanded, his voice carrying enough alpha authority to make Kira drop to her knees involuntarily. "The servant girl," Mira replied, acting on behalf of Seraphina Goldmane. Kieran's attention fixed on Kira with lethal intensity. "You poisoned my mate." It was not a question, and the girl seemed to realize that denial would be pointless. "I was promised," she began. "You were promised nothing," Kieran snarled, his wolf rising so close to the surface that his eyes blazed like silver flames. Because the woman who made that promise has no authority to grant land, status, or anything else. She is not Luna. She never will be Luna. And you just tried to murder the one person who actually holds that title. Lyra managed to push herself up to sitting, the crystal's power having restored enough of her strength to move. But as she looked at Kira, she felt something unexpected stirring in her chest. Not anger or desire for revenge, but something that felt almost like pity. "She is young," Lyra said, her voice still rough from the poison, but gaining strength with each word. And she was manipulated by someone who should have known better. Kieran turned to her with confusion and no small amount of irritation. "She tried to kill you. On the night before your awakening ritual, when your death would have prevented the return of the Moonright bloodline forever." "I know," Lyra replied, pulling herself to her feet with Mira's help. "But killing her will not undo what happened, and it will not stop Seraphina from finding others to manipulate." As if summoned by her name, Seraphina herself appeared in the temple doorway, flanked by several of her family's warriors. Her beautiful face was a mask of concern, but Lyra could see the calculation in her eyes as she took in the scene. "Your Majesty," Seraphina said with perfect political smoothness, "I came as soon as I heard about the disturbance. Is everyone all right?" Kieran's response was a growl that made the temple stones vibrate. "Your servant just tried to poison my mate, on your orders." Seraphina's expression shifted to one of shocked innocence. "Surely you cannot believe I would be involved in something so terrible. If this girl has acted against Lady Lyra, she did so on her own initiative. Perhaps she was jealous of the attention you have been showing a fellow servant." The lie was delivered with such practised ease that Lyra almost admired the skill behind it. Almost. But her newly enhanced senses could detect the deception in Seraphina's scent, could hear the slight acceleration of her heartbeat that betrayed her guilt. "You are lying," Lyra said, stepping forward with silver light still dancing around her skin. "I can smell the falsehood on you. I can hear your heart racing with the effort of maintaining the deception." Seraphina's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold fury beneath. "How convenient that you suddenly claim supernatural abilities just when you need them to make accusations." But before anyone could respond, the crystal suddenly pulsed with brilliant light, and images appeared in the air above it like ghostly projections. They showed Seraphina meeting with Kira in a shadowed corner of the servant quarters, promising gold and status in exchange for Lyra's death. They showed the poison being prepared in Seraphina's private chambers. They showed everything. The crystal had been watching, and now it was revealing the truth for all to see. Seraphina's warriors stepped back from their leader as the evidence of her treachery played out before them. Even they could not deny what the ancient magic was showing them. "Seraphina Goldmane," Kieran said, his voice carrying the formal authority of royal judgment. "You stand accused of attempting to murder the Lunar Queen. How do you answer?" For a moment, Seraphina seemed to consider maintaining her denials. Then something shifted in her expression, and when she spoke again, all pretense of innocence was gone. "I answer that she is not queen of anything," Seraphina said, her voice dripping with venom. "She is a temple servant who has somehow managed to enchant you with parlour tricks and ancient nonsense. When you come to your senses, you will realise what a mistake you have made." The crystal's light flared brighter, and Lyra felt power rushing through her veins like liquid fire. Her wolf rose to the surface, no longer cowering or uncertain, but fierce and protective and ready to defend what was hers. "Then you have made your choice," she said, and for the first time in her life her voice carried the unmistakable authority of royal blood. "And now you will face the consequences." The silver light around her suddenly intensified, and everyone in the temple felt the weight of ancient power awakening after centuries of slumber. The night after Seraphina's treachery was exposed, Lyra could not sleep. She stood in the hidden chamber beneath the temple, watching the moonlight crystal with growing unease as hairline cracks spread across its once perfect surface. The fractures were so fine they looked like threads of silver against the crystalline structure, but they were spreading with each pulse of power that flowed between her and the ancient artifact. Elder Priestess Mira had warned her this would happen as the awakening ritual approached. The crystal had been designed to contain the accumulated power of the Moonlight bloodline for centuries, but it was never meant to hold that energy forever. As Lyra's true nature emerged and her connection to the artifact strengthened, the containment matrix was beginning to fail. "The cracks are spreading faster tonight," she murmured, pressing her palm against the crystal's warm surface. The moment her skin made contact, she felt the surge of power that had become familiar over the past few days, but now it came with an undercurrent of pain that made her gasp. The crystal was not just failing, it was fighting to contain power that had grown beyond its original limits. "Because your emotions are stronger tonight," Kieran said from behind her, his voice carrying the rough edge of exhaustion. He had been pushing himself to the limits of even an Alpha King's endurance, coordinating security measures and dealing with the political fallout from Seraphina's exposure as a would-be assassin. Lyra turned to face him, noting the tension in his shoulders and the silver fire that still burned in his eyes. The mate bond hummed between them constantly now, a golden thread of connection that let each of them feel the other's emotional state. Right now, that connection was flooding her with his protective fury and bone-deep worry. "I can feel your fear," he continued, moving closer until he could cup her face in his hands. "Your uncertainty about the ritual, your worry about what will happen if the crystal fails before the awakening is complete. All of that emotional turbulence is feeding back into the artifact and destabilizing it further." Lyra leaned into his touch, drawing comfort from the solid warmth of his presence. "Mira says the ritual must be performed during tomorrow night's lunar eclipse, or we will lose the optimal magical conditions for months. But what if the crystal shatters before then? What if all that power is released at once without the ritual structure to help me absorb it safely?" Kieran's thumb traced across her cheekbone, his silver eyes reflecting the crystal's flickering light. "Then we will face whatever happens together. The mate bond will help anchor you, give you something to hold on to when the power threatens to overwhelm your human consciousness." As if responding to his words, the crystal pulsed with particularly brilliant light, and the largest crack suddenly extended another inch across its surface. Both of them felt the surge of released energy that followed, a wave of raw power that made the temple stones vibrate and sent silver light dancing across the chamber walls. "It is getting worse," Lyra whispered, pulling her hands away from the crystal as pain lanced up her arms. "I can feel it trying to hold together, but the pressure is building beyond what it can contain." They were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the hidden stairs, and Elder Priestess Mira appeared in the chamber entrance with urgency written across her weathered features. In her arms she carried an ancient tome bound in silver leather, its pages yellowed with age but still radiating faint magical energy. "I have been searching the archives for anything that might help stabilize the crystal until tomorrow night," Mira said, setting the book down on the stone pedestal beside the artifact. "And I found something that changes everything we thought we knew about the awakening process." She opened the tome to a page covered with symbols that seemed to shift and move in the silver light, and when she began to read, her voice took on the resonant quality of ancient magic. "The Moonlight awakening is not meant to be performed alone," she translated. "The original ritual required both the Alpha King and the Lunar Queen to participate, their combined bloodlines creating a stable matrix for the power transfer. When performed solo, the risk of magical cascade failure increases exponentially." Kieran straightened, his attention sharpening with predatory intensity. "You are saying that I am supposed to be part of the ritual, that my bloodline is necessary for Lyra to safely absorb the crystal's power?" "More than that," Mira replied, turning to another page that showed detailed diagrams of ritual circles and power flows. According to this text, the Alpha King serves as an anchor point during the transformation. His power grounds the Lunar Queen, prevents her from being consumed by forces beyond mortal comprehension. Lyra felt a chill run down her spine as the implications sank in. But that means if something goes wrong during the awakening, it will not just destroy me, it will destroy both of us. The crystal suddenly flared with light so brilliant that they all had to shield their eyes, and when the radiance faded, new cracks had appeared across its entire surface. The artifact was no longer just failing gradually, it was approaching complete structural collapse. "We may not have until tomorrow night," Kieran said grimly, noting the same thing she had. "At this rate, the crystal will shatter within hours." As if his words had been a prophecy, a low rumble suddenly echoed through the temple stones above them. It was not the sound of thunder or earthquake, but something far more ominous. It was the sound of dark magic being channeled by practitioners who had no regard for the consequences of their actions. Mira's face went pale with recognition and fear. "Seraphina has not given up. She has brought sorcerers to corrupt the crystal's matrix, to force it to fail catastrophically before the awakening can be completed." The rumbling grew stronger, and now they could hear voices chanting in languages that predated written history. The words carried power that made the very air feel thick and oppressive, and the crystal began to resonate with the dark frequencies being projected toward it. "They are trying to turn the crystal's power against itself," Lyra realized with growing horror. "If they succeed in creating a magical cascade failure, the explosion will level half the territory and kill everyone within miles." Kieran's wolf rose to the surface, silver fire blazing in his eyes as he prepared for battle. "Then we stop them, now, before they can complete whatever ritual they have started." But even as he spoke, another massive crack split the crystal's surface, and this time the pain that lanced through Lyra was strong enough to drive her to her knees. The mate bond carried her agony directly to Kieran, making him stagger as her suffering became his own. "There is no time," she gasped, struggling to breathe through waves of power that felt like liquid lightning in her veins. "The crystal is going to fail, whether we are ready or not. We have to attempt the awakening ritual now, without proper preparation, or lose everything." Elder Priestess Mira moved with surprising speed for someone her age, pulling ritual supplies from hidden alcoves around the chamber. "Then we do this the ancient way, with nothing but faith and the power of your bond to see you through. But you must understand the risks. Attempting the awakening under these conditions, with dark magic actively working against the process, could result in transformation into something that is no longer entirely human." The crystal pulsed again, and this time hairline fractures spread across every remaining intact section. Whatever Seraphina's sorcerers were doing above, it was working. The containment matrix was minutes away from complete failure. "We knew the risks when we accepted the mate bond," Kieran said, taking Lyra's hands and helping her to her feet. "Whatever happens, we face it together." As the dark chanting above grew louder and more urgent, Lyra looked into her mate's silver eyes and made the choice that would either save their world or destroy it completely. "Then let us begin," she said, placing her hands on the cracking crystal one final time. "And may the goddess help us all." The moment her palms touched the artifact's surface, power exploded through the chamber with enough force to shake the temple's foundations. The awakening had begun, ready or not, and there was no turning back from whatever they were about to become. The dark chanting above the temple grew to a crescendo as shadows began to seep through the ancient stones, carrying with them the stench of corrupted magic and malevolent intent. Lyra could feel the wrongness of it pressing against her skin like oil, making her wolf recoil in instinctive revulsion. Whatever Seraphina had summoned to help her destroy the crystal, it was something that should never have been allowed to touch sacred ground. "They are calling shadow wolves," Elder Priestess Mira said, her voice tight with fear as she completed the ritual circle around the failing crystal. Creatures that were banished from our realm centuries ago for feeding on the life force of their own kind. Seraphina has made a pact with something far more dangerous than she understands. As if summoned by her words, inhuman howls began to echo through the temple above, sounds that carried notes of hunger and corruption that made every supernatural being within miles feel their hackles rise. These were not the voices of natural wolves, but something that had been twisted by dark magic into a perversion of what the goddess had created. Kieran's entire body went rigid with battle readiness, his silver eyes blazing as his wolf rose to meet the threat. How many? Too many, Mira replied, her ancient senses reading the magical signatures that filled the temple grounds. At least a dozen shadow wolves, plus the sorcerers who summoned them, plus whatever human allies Seraphina has managed to corrupt with promises of power. The crystals suddenly convulsed, sending a shockwave of energy through the hidden chamber that made the walls crack and debris rain down from the ceiling. The artifact's surface was now more crack than crystal, held together by little more than the force of will and the residual power it contained. "We are out of time!" Lyra gasped, feeling liquid fire race through her veins as the crystal's energy sought an outlet. If we do not complete the awakening now, the cascade failure will kill everyone in the territory. Kieran moved to stand opposite her across the ritual circle, his hands extending to clasp hers as Mira began the ancient words that would either save them or destroy them. The moment their fingers touched, the mate bond flared with such intensity that silver light began to pour from their joined hands. But before Mira could complete the first verse of the awakening ritual, the hidden chamber's entrance exploded inward in a shower of stone and darkness. Shadow wolves poured through the breach like liquid night, their forms shifting and flowing in ways that defied natural law. Behind them came figures in dark robes, their faces hidden but their intentions clear in the malevolent energy that radiated from their bodies. "Kill the girl," one of the sorcerers commanded, his voice carrying the hollow echo of someone who had traded his humanity for power. "The crystal's energy will dissipate if its guardian dies before the awakening is complete." The shadow wolves launched themselves toward Lyra with inhuman speed, their forms dissolving and reforming as they moved to avoid physical obstacles. But they had not counted on the crystal's instinctive desire to protect its chosen guardian. Silver light erupted from the artifact with explosive force, creating a barrier of pure energy that sent the shadow creatures reeling backward. The light was so bright and pure that it seemed to cause them physical pain, their corrupted forms wavering as if they might dissolve entirely. "The crystal defends itself," Mira shouted over the sounds of battle, continuing the ritual chant even as chaos erupted around them. "But it cannot hold them off for long in its current state." Kieran released one of Lyra's hands and stepped forward, his body beginning to shift as his wolf rose fully to the surface. But this was not the controlled partial transformation he had shown before. This was the full emergence of an Alpha King's primal power, and the sight of it made even the shadow wolves hesitate. His human form expanded and reshaped itself, bones cracking and reforming as silver fur sprouted across his skin. When the transformation was complete, he stood before them, not as a man who could shift into a wolf, but as something far more ancient and powerful. The silver wolf that faced the shadow creatures was the size of a small horse, with eyes that burned like stars and fangs that gleamed with their own inner light. He launched himself at the nearest group of attackers with a roar that shook the chamber foundations, moving with speed and grace that defied his massive size. Where his claws struck the shadow wolves, they did not just wound. They purified, silver fire burning away the corruption that animated the unnatural creatures. But there were too many enemies, and more were pouring into the chamber with each passing moment. Lyra could see that even Kieran's incredible power would not be enough to hold them all off while she completed the awakening ritual. That was when she felt it. a stirring in the deepest part of her soul, a presence that had been sleeping for centuries but was now beginning to wake. The crystal's power was not just flowing into her, it was awakening something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. "I call upon the power of my bloodline," she said, her voice taking on harmonics that seemed to resonate through the very fabric of reality. "I call upon the spirits of my ancestors, the queens who ruled before me, the guardians who protected our people when darkness threatened to consume the world." The crystal's light suddenly intensified beyond anything they had seen before, and ghostly figures began to materialize around the ritual circle. Ancient queens with silver fire blazing in their eyes, warriors who had died defending their people, guardians who had given their lives to protect the sacred artifacts. They stood in silent support of their descendant, their combined will adding strength to the awakening process. Lyra felt power rushing into her body like a flood, transforming her on a cellular level as her human limitations fell away. Her senses expanded until she could hear the heartbeats of creatures miles away, could smell the fear and desperation of her enemies, could see the magical threads that connected all living things. But the transformation was not just physical. She could feel her consciousness expanding as well, touching the minds of every wolf in the territory, sensing their fears and hopes and desperate desire for leadership that would guide them through the darkness that threatened to engulf their world. One of the sorcerers raised his staff, preparing to channel a bolt of corrupted energy directly at her heart, but Lyra simply looked at him and spoke a single word in the ancient tongue of her people. "Begone." The word carried such authority, such pure command backed by generations of royal power, that the sorcerer's magic turned against him. Instead of striking Lyra, his own spell wrapped around his body like chains of darkness, binding him in the corruption he had sought to wield against others. The shadow wolves that had been pressing their attack suddenly found themselves unable to approach the ritual circle, as if an invisible barrier of silver light now protected the space where the awakening was taking place. Those that tried to force their way through the barrier simply dissolved, their corrupted forms unable to withstand the purifying power that radiated from Lyra's transforming body. Kieran, still in his massive wolf form, turned to look at his mate and felt his breath catch at what he saw. Lyra stood in the centre of the ritual circle, with silver light pouring from her skin, her dark hair floating around her as if moved by supernatural wind. But it was her eyes that took his breath away. They blazed with the accumulated wisdom and power of every queen who had come before her, ancient and knowing and absolutely magnificent. "My queen," he said, his wolf's voice carrying the reverence of recognition and the deep satisfaction of a bond that had found its perfect completion. The largest crack in the crystal suddenly split wide, but instead of shattering completely, the artifact began to reshape itself. The crystalline structure flowed like liquid, reforming into something new and more beautiful than before. When the transformation was complete, the crystal had become a perfect sphere of silver light, pulsing in rhythm with Lyra's heartbeat and radiating power that felt like concentrated starlight. "The awakening is complete," Elder Priestess Mira said, her voice filled with awe as she witnessed the fulfillment of prophecies that had been spoken for centuries. "The true Lunar Queen has claimed her birthright." The remaining enemies in the chamber took one look at the transformed Lyra, at the ghostly queens who still stood guard around her, at the Alpha King whose silver fire now burned in harmony with her own power, and made the only choice that offered them any chance of survival. They fled, dissolving back into the shadows from which they had come, carrying word back to their mistress that the temple servant she had tried to destroy was now something far beyond her ability to comprehend or control. As the last of the attackers vanished, Lyra turned to face Kieran, and when she smiled, silver light danced in her eyes like captured starfire. "Hello, my king," she said, and her voice carried the warmth of personal affection threaded through with the unmistakable authority of someone who had been born to rule. The sacred chamber fell silent except for the gentle humming of the reformed crystal, and in that silence they both felt the weight of destiny settling around them like a crown. The reformed crystal had barely finished pulsing with the completion of Lyra's awakening when the temple above erupted with sounds of total war. What had begun as Seraphina's desperate assassination attempt had escalated into a full-scale assault on the sacred grounds, and the noise of battle filtered down through the ancient stones with terrifying intensity. Lyra felt every clash of claws and fangs through her newly expanded consciousness, her awareness now encompassing every wolf within the territory boundaries. She could sense the confusion and fear of pack members who had been pulled from their beds by the sounds of combat, could feel the pain of those who had already fallen to the Shadow Wolves' corrupted touch. "They are not just trying to kill us anymore," she said, her voice carrying new harmonics of power as she processed the scope of the attack. "Seraphina has brought an army. She means to destroy the entire pack and claim the territory for herself." Kieran, still in his massive silver wolf form, lifted his head toward the chamber ceiling as inhuman howls echoed through the temple stones. She has made her final mistake. An attack on pack grounds during a sacred ritual is an act of war that demands blood payment. Elder Priestess Mira moved toward the chamber entrance, her ancient face set with grim determination. "The other packs will feel the disturbance in the magical matrix. They will come to investigate, but not quickly enough to help us now. We must hold the temple until reinforcements arrive." But as they prepared to ascend to the main chamber and face the assault, the crystal suddenly flared with warning light. Lyra pressed her palm against its reformed surface and gasped as visions flooded her mind, showing her the true scope of what they faced. Seraphina had not just brought sorcerers and shadow wolves. She had corrupted members of their own pack, turning them against their alpha through dark magic that fed on their fears and resentments. Former allies now moved through the temple grounds with black veins pulsing beneath their skin, their eyes reflecting the hollow light of those who had traded their souls for temporary power. "She has turned at least 20 of our own people," Lyra reported, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "The corruption spreads through bite and claw. Anyone wounded by the turned wolves will join their ranks unless cleansed immediately." Kieran's wolf form rippled with barely contained fury, silver fire blazing in his eyes as he contemplated the violation of everything sacred about pack bonds. "Then we end this now, before more of our people fall to her poison." They ascended the hidden stairs together, but the moment they emerged into the main temple chamber, Lyra realized that even her awakened power might not be enough to save everyone she cared about. The sacred space had become a battlefield, with corrupted pack members and shadow wolves pressing attacks against the few loyal warriors who had managed to reach defensive positions. At the center of the chaos stood Seraphina herself, no longer bothering to maintain her facade of noble beauty. Dark magic swirled around her like living smoke, and her once perfect features had been twisted by the corrupted power she had embraced. She stood before the main altar, her hands raised as she channeled energy from a ritual circle carved into the marble floor with what looked like fresh blood. "Too late!" she called out when she saw them, her voice carrying the hollow echo of dark sorcery. "The corruption ritual is nearly complete. Soon every wolf in this territory will serve me, and your precious mate bond will be just another tool for me to use against you." Lyra felt the truth of the threat through her connection to the pack consciousness. The ritual circle Seraphina had carved was designed to spread corruption through the territorial bonds that connected all pack members to their alpha. If it succeeded, every wolf for miles would be turned into a mindless servant of whatever dark forces Seraphina served. "Not if I stop you first," Lyra said, stepping forward as silver light began to pour from her skin with increasing intensity. But before she could act, one of the corrupted pack members launched himself at her from the shadows. She recognized him as Marcus, a young warrior who had always been kind to the temple servants, and the sight of his twisted features nearly broke her heart. Black veins pulsed beneath his skin, and his eyes reflected nothing of the gentle soul she had known. Kieran intercepted the attack with fluid grace, his massive form slamming into Marcus and sending the corrupted warrior flying across the temple floor. But even as he protected his mate, more enemies closed in from all sides. That was when Lyra made the choice that would either save her people or destroy them all. She reached out with her newly awakened power and touched the minds of every wolf within the territory, sending her voice directly into their consciousness with the authority of a true Lunar Queen. "I am Lyra Moonright, last daughter of the ancient line, your Lunar Queen by right of blood and bond. I call upon you to resist the corruption, to remember who you truly are." The effect was immediate and devastating. The territorial bonds that Seraphina had been trying to corrupt suddenly flared with silver light as Lyra claimed them, pouring her own purifying energy through the connections that linked every pack member to their leadership. The black veins that had been spreading through the turned wolves' bodies began to recede as the corruption was burned away by royal power. Marcus collapsed to his knees as the dark magic left his system, his eyes clearing as his true self returned. Around the temple, other corrupted pack members cried out as they were freed from the influence that had been controlling them. But Seraphina was not finished. With a shriek of rage that shattered several of the temple's ancient windows, she poured more power into her ritual circle. "If I cannot have this territory, then I will make sure no one can. I call upon the void between worlds, the hungry darkness that devours light itself." The temperature in the temple dropped 20 degrees in an instant as something vast and malevolent began to respond to her summons. This was no longer just dark magic. This was an attempt to tear a hole in reality itself, to invite something into their world that should never have been allowed to exist in any realm. "She is going to destroy everything!" Elder Priestess Mira gasped, recognizing the nature of the ritual Seraphina was attempting. "If that void creature manifests fully, it will consume our entire reality." Lyra felt the weight of impossible choice settling on her shoulders. To stop Seraphina's ritual, she would have to pour all of her newly awakened power into a counterspell that might very well kill her. The crystal had given her the strength of generations, but using it all at once could burn out her human consciousness entirely. But as she looked around the temple at the people she had sworn to protect, at the mate who had chosen her despite every obstacle, at the sacred space that had been her sanctuary for her entire life, she knew there was no choice at all. "Kieran," she said, and her voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had made peace with their fate. "I need you to do something for me." He shifted back to human form instantly, moving to her side with desperate urgency. "Whatever you are thinking, we will find another way." "There is no other way," she replied, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "The crystal gave me power, but it also gave me purpose. I am the guardian of this realm, and sometimes guardians must sacrifice everything to protect what they love." Before he could protest, she turned toward the failing crystal that still pulsed with residual energy. With deliberate intent, she drove her fist into its reformed surface, shattering the artifact completely. The explosion of released power was beyond anything anyone in the temple had ever witnessed. Silver light erupted from the broken crystal with the force of a supernova, carrying with it every scrap of energy the Moonright line had accumulated over centuries of guardianship. But instead of trying to contain that power or channel it safely, Lyra opened herself completely and let it pour through her body like liquid starfire. She became a conduit for forces that no mortal was meant to wield, accepting the possibility of destruction in order to save everything she held dear. The void creature that Seraphina had been summoning recoiled from the pure light that now blazed from Lyra's transformed body, its alien shriek of pain echoing across dimensions as it fled back to whatever dark realm had spawned it. The corruption ritual collapsed entirely, its power structure unable to withstand the cleansing force of royal authority backed by centuries of accumulated magical energy. Seraphina herself was caught in the backlash of her own shattered spell, dark magic turning against her as the void creature's retreat severed their connection violently. She collapsed to the temple floor, her body convulsing as the prices of her bargains came due all at once. But it was not over yet. The power flowing through Lyra was still building, still growing beyond anything her mortal frame could contain. She could feel her consciousness beginning to fray at the edges, her human identity threatening to dissolve entirely under the weight of godlike energy. That was when Kieran did the only thing that could save her. He stepped forward and placed his hands on her shoulders, opening his own soul to the mate bond and offering himself as an anchor point for her dissolving sense of self. The silver fire that blazed around her suddenly found a focus, a connection to something that mattered more than power or duty or ancient prophecies. "Come back to me," he said, his voice cutting through the roar of magical energy with the simple truth of their connection. "You are not just a queen or a guardian. You are my mate, and I refuse to lose you to anything, even your own nobility." The power that had been threatening to consume her suddenly found its proper balance, flowing between them through the mate bond in patterns that were sustainable rather than destructive. Instead of burning her out, the awakened abilities settled into her consciousness like pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. When the silver light finally faded, Lyra stood in the centre of the devastated temple as something entirely new. She was still herself, still the woman who had spent her life cleaning floors and tending to forgotten spaces. But now she was also the rightful Lunar Queen, carrying the accumulated wisdom and power of her bloodline in perfect harmony with her own individual strength. Seraphina lay broken at the base of the altar, her corruption-twisted form finally still as the dark magic that had sustained her was purged from the sacred space. Around them, pack members who had been freed from her influence looked up at their true Luna with expressions of awe and absolute loyalty. "My queen," Marcus said, the first to bend his knee in formal acknowledgement of her authority. "Forgive us for not recognizing you sooner." One by one, every wolf in the temple followed his example, until Lyra stood surrounded by her people's willing submission and genuine respect. But when she looked at Kieran, she saw not reverence, but something infinitely more precious, the warm recognition of a mate who loved both the queen and the woman she had always been. "So," he said with the hint of a smile that made her heart skip despite everything they had just survived, "I suppose this makes me your king consort." "I suppose it does," she replied, and for the first time since her awakening began, she allowed herself to simply be happy. In the aftermath of the crystal's destruction, silence settled over the temple like a benediction. The ancient stones still hummed with residual power, and where the moonlight crystal had once stood, a pool of liquid silver light swirled in patterns that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of Lyra's heartbeat. She stood at the centre of it all, no longer the invisible temple servant who had scrubbed these floors for years, but something magnificent and terrible and utterly transformed. Silver fire danced beneath her skin, visible through her mortal flesh like starlight contained within crystal. Her dark hair moved as if touched by supernatural wind, and when she turned to survey the assembled pack members who knelt around her, her eyes blazed with the accumulated wisdom of every queen who had ruled before her. "Rise," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in the very bones of those who heard it. "You kneel to me not because I demand it, but because you choose it, and I would rather have your willing loyalty than your fearful submission." One by one, the pack members rose to their feet, but the awe in their expressions remained. They had witnessed something that would become legend, the moment when the last daughter of the ancient bloodline claimed her birthright and became everything the prophecies had promised. Marcus stepped forward, his face still showing the lingering effects of his corruption, but his eyes clear and determined. "My queen, what would you have us do with the traitors who aided Seraphina in her assault on sacred ground?" Lyra looked toward the handful of pack members who had voluntarily joined Seraphina's cause, not through magical corruption, but through their own choices. They cowered against the temple walls, clearly expecting death or exile for their betrayal. "Bring them forward," she commanded, and her voice held no anger, only the weight of absolute authority. The traitors were dragged before her, some weeping, others maintaining defiant silence even in the face of their obvious defeat. But when Lyra looked at them, she saw not enemies to be punished, but lost souls who had been led astray by promises of power and status they had never been offered through legitimate means. "You betrayed your pack, your alpha, and your sacred duties," she said, her silver eyes reflecting light that seemed to come from within. "By all rights, such treason demands the ultimate price, but I am not interested in ruling through fear or in beginning my reign with unnecessary bloodshed." She raised her hand, and silver light began to gather around her fingers like condensed moonbeams. "Instead, I offer you a choice. Accept the mark of redemption and swear new oaths of loyalty, or leave this territory forever and never return. But know that if you choose to stay, your betrayal will be burned from your souls, and you will serve this pack with the devotion you should have shown from the beginning." The first traitor, a middle-aged warrior named Thomas, who had been bitter about his low ranking, threw himself to his knees before her. "Please, my queen, I was wrong. I was jealous and foolish, and I let that poison my judgment. Give me the chance to serve you as I should have served from the start." Lyra placed a hand on his forehead, and silver fire flowed from her fingers into his body. For a moment, Thomas convulsed as the cleansing power burned through him, purging not just the lingering traces of dark magic, but the resentment and bitterness that had made him vulnerable to Seraphina's manipulation in the first place. When the light faded, Thomas looked up at her with tears streaming down his face. "I feel it," he whispered, "the pack bond, stronger than it has ever been. And I understand now what I threw away when I chose to follow her instead of waiting for our true Luna to reveal herself." One by one, the other traitors made the same choice, accepting her offer of redemption rather than facing exile. As each received the mark of silver fire, the pack bonds grew stronger, more unified than they had been in generations. But not everyone in the temple was focused on the political implications of Lyra's mercy. Kieran stood watching his mate with an expression that combined pride, desire, and something deeper than either emotion could encompass. She was magnificent in her power, terrible in her authority, and absolutely, undeniably his. When the last traitor had been marked and sworn back into pack loyalty, Lyra turned to face the assembled crowd, with silver light still dancing around her like a living aurora. "I am Lyra Moonright," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the temple and beyond, reaching every wolf within the territorial boundaries through the strengthened pack bonds. "Last daughter of the ancient bloodline, guardian of the sacred powers, and by right of blood and bond, your Lunar Queen. I claim this territory, and all who dwell within it under my protection." The formal declaration sent a shockwave through the magical matrix that connected all supernatural territories, announcing her awakening to every pack, coven and court across the continent. There would be no doubt now about her legitimacy or her power. Kieran stepped forward, his silver eyes reflecting the light that poured from her transformed body. "And I am Kieran Blackthorn, Alpha King by conquest and right, and I claim this Luna as my mate, my queen, and my equal in all things." The mate bond between them suddenly flared with such intensity that everyone in the temple could see it, golden threads of connection that wrapped around them both and bound them together on every level that mattered. It was not just romantic love or physical attraction, but a partnership of souls that would endure beyond death itself. Elder Priestess Mira stepped forward, her ancient face glowing with joy as she witnessed the fulfillment of prophecies she had guarded her entire life. Then let the formal claiming be witnessed by all present. Let it be recorded in the ancient chronicles that on this night the Moonright bloodline returned to power and chose its king consort with the blessing of the goddess herself. What followed was not a traditional mating ceremony, because nothing about their situation had followed traditional patterns. Instead, it was a claiming that drew on rituals from both their bloodlines, ancient words in languages that predated written history, and vows that bound them not just to each other, but to the sacred duty they would share. When Kieran took her hands and spoke his acceptance of the mate bond before their assembled people, Lyra felt the last pieces of her transformation settle into place. She was no longer torn between her duty as guardian and her desires as a woman. She was both, seamlessly integrated into something greater than either role could have been alone. "I accept you as my mate, my king, my partner in all things," she replied, and when they kissed, the entire temple was bathed in silver and gold light that seemed to bless their union with divine approval. The pack's response was immediate and overwhelming. Howls of celebration rose from every throat, a song of joy and recognition that echoed across the territory and announced to the world that the Moonright line had not only returned, but had found its perfect complement in the Alpha King who had chosen love over political convenience. As the formal ceremonies concluded and the pack members began to disperse to spread word of their new Luna throughout the territory, Lyra found herself alone with Kieran in the centre of the transformed temple. The space around them still glowed with residual power, but now it felt warm and welcoming rather than dangerous. "So," Kieran said, his voice carrying the hint of amusement that always made her heart skip, "how does it feel to be queen of everything you can see?" Lyra looked around the temple that had been her sanctuary, her prison, and finally her coronation chamber, then turned back to the man who had seen her worth when she could not see it herself. "It feels like coming home," she said simply, "but not because of the power or the title or the recognition. Because I finally understand who I was meant to be, and I have someone to share it with who loves both the queen and the woman who cleans temple floors." Kieran stepped closer, his hands framing her face as silver light danced in her eyes like captured starfire. "I fell in love with the woman who had strength enough to tend a sacred duty in secret for years. The queen is magnificent, but she is not why my wolf chose you." When he kissed her again, gentler this time, more intimate, Lyra felt the last of her old fears dissolve. She had spent her entire life being told she was nothing, but now she knew the truth. She had always been everything she was meant to be. She had simply been waiting for the right moment and the right partner to let that truth shine.